The moment a medieval child reached 13, life began to change in ways that would seem almost unimaginable to most teenagers today. There were no classrooms, smartphones, or carefree afternoons stretching into the evening. Instead, many young people found themselves stepping into responsibilities we would consider far beyond their years, following unfamiliar traditions and living by customs that feel surprising to us today. And yet, to them, this was simply the world they knew. So tonight, as you settle in, get comfortable, and let the day slowly drift away, we'll journey back through quiet villages, busy marketplaces, and winding medieval streets to discover what it was really like to grow up in the Middle Ages, and why being a teenager back then was a far stranger experience than most of us could ever imagine. In the Middle Ages, growing up could happen almost without warning. One day, you were still a child. You played with others your age. You stayed close to your family. You spent your days learning the small things you needed to know about the world around you. But slowly, something began to change. The people around you started seeing you differently. You were no longer simply the little child who needed to be guided. You were becoming someone who could help, someone who could work, someone who could be trusted with more. Perhaps one day, your parents asked you to take on a task you had never been trusted with before. Maybe you were old enough to work in the fields, to care for animals, to help prepare food, or to handle a job that once seemed far too difficult for you. And nobody needed to tell you that things were changing. You could feel it in the way people spoke to you, in the work they gave you, in the expectations they placed on you. The world around you was quietly beginning to treat you less like a child, and more like someone who would soon have to stand on their own. For many medieval young people, this change did not happen on one particular birthday. It happened little by little. A little more work, a little more responsibility, a little less time to simply play. And before you knew it, the carefree days of childhood were slowly becoming something you remembered. But there was something especially strange about this transition. You could still feel like a child inside. You could still want to play. You could still laugh with your friends. You could still become excited over the smallest things. And yet, the people around you are already preparing you for a completely different life. A life where your work mattered, where your choices affected others, and where, sooner or later, you would have to find your own place in the world. For some young people, this happened while they were still living at home. For others, growing up meant leaving their family behind. And for many, it meant learning a skill that would shape almost everything about their future. Because in the medieval world, becoming an adult was not simply about getting older. It was about slowly becoming someone that other people could depend on. And perhaps the most surprising part is that this could happen much earlier than we might expect. Because there was no modern idea of being a teenager, at least not in the way we understand it today. Today, we have a word for people between childhood and adulthood: teenager. It is a simple word, but it describes a very specific stage of life. You are not a little child anymore, but you are not expected to have everything figured out either. You are somewhere in between. In the Middle Ages, life was not divided quite so neatly. There was no special period where you could simply take your time becoming an adult. Instead, young people slowly moved into new responsibilities as they grew older. And what happened to you depended greatly on the life you had been born into. If you were growing up on a farm, your teenage years might mean waking before sunrise, helping your family, and learning the daily rhythms that kept the household alive. You could be looking after animals, working in the fields, or learning the skills needed to support the people around you. If you lived in a town, your life could look completely different. You might become an apprentice, learning a craft from someone with years of experience. You could spend years learning how to make shoes, clothing, tools, or other goods that people depended on. And if you were born into a wealthy family, you might have more time for education and preparation for the future. So there was no single experience of being young in medieval society. Your family, your wealth, and even the place where you lived could completely change the path ahead of you. But there was something that connected many young people. As they grew older, they became more useful to the people around them. Their hands could work, their minds could learn, and their choices could begin shaping the future of their family. This meant that growing up was not simply about reaching a certain age. It was about slowly becoming someone others depended on. A young person could still enjoy playing games with friends. They could still laugh and have fun. They could still feel nervous, excited, or uncertain about what the future might bring. But at the same time, they might already be learning the work they would continue for much of their life. This is what makes medieval teenage life so fascinating. Young people were not simply children who suddenly became adults overnight. They were slowly being prepared for the world waiting ahead of them. And sometimes that preparation was anything but gentle. Because for many young people, the first real step toward adulthood was not choosing a career or deciding exactly who they wanted to become. It was simply waking up one morning and realizing there was work to be done. For some medieval teenagers, growing up meant something even more difficult than working alongside their family. It meant leaving home. Imagine being young, perhaps only in your early teens, and being told that you were going to live somewhere else. Not for a few days, not for a short visit, but for years. You would leave behind your parents, your brothers and sisters, your familiar home, and everything you had known since childhood. Instead, you would travel to a town or village where you would begin learning a trade. This was the life of an apprentice. An apprentice was a young person who lived and worked with someone who had already mastered a particular skill. Perhaps a blacksmith, a shoemaker, a tailor, a carpenter, or another skilled craftsperson. The idea was simple. You would learn by watching, by listening, and most importantly, by practicing the work yourself. But being an apprentice was not like attending a modern school. There was no classroom where you could sit for a few hours before returning home. Your work and your living space were often connected. From morning until evening, the sounds of the workshop would surround you. The movement of workers, the preparation of materials, and the steady rhythm of people creating things by hand. And your first tasks were not always exciting. You might spend your days cleaning, carrying materials, preparing tools, or completing the small jobs that needed to be done before the real work could begin. Day after day, you slowly improved. You watched how things were made. You copied what you saw. And over time, you became more skilled at your craft. That perhaps the hardest part was not the work itself. It was adjusting to a completely new life. You were young. You were away from your family. And you were now living under someone else's rules. Your master was not your parent, but they had authority over you. You were expected to listen, to work hard, and to follow the ways of the household. For a teenager who had spent their childhood surrounded by family, this could be a huge change. Suddenly, you had to find your place among unfamiliar faces. You had to create a new routine, and you had to prove that you could be trusted. But there was also something exciting about this new life. For the first time, you were developing a skill that could truly belong to you. If you became good enough, that skill could help you earn a living and build a future of your own. So while leaving home could be lonely, it could also be the beginning of something new. You were no longer simply helping your family. You were preparing for the person you would eventually become. And perhaps, after a long day in the workshop, you might have looked back at the life you once knew and realized something. You were growing up, not because someone had announced that you were an adult, but because you were slowly learning how to stand on your own. Still, not every young person had the chance to learn a trade. For many, another path was waiting, and that path was far less common than it is today. Education. Because, in the medieval world, learning was not something every young person could simply expect to have. Today, Going to school is such a normal part of growing up that it can be easy to forget how unusual it once was. For most young people today, education is simply part of life. You wake up. You get ready. You go to school. You sit in a classroom with others your age. And you learn things that might help you build a future one day. But in the Middle Ages, most young people did not have this kind of experience. There were no schools waiting for every child. No expectation that everyone would spend their younger years sitting in classrooms. For many families, there was simply too much work to be done. If you were needed at home, you worked. If your family had a farm, you helped with the farm. If your parents had a trade, you might learn that trade. And if your family needed you to earn money, working became more important than studying. Education was often a privilege. And for those who did receive it, the experience could be very different from school today. A young person might learn to read and write. They could study religious texts. They might learn languages or skills that would help them in their future work. But even then, education was not always easy to access. The chance to study depended greatly on your family and your circumstances. A child from a wealthy household might have opportunities that were completely out of reach for someone growing up in a poor farming family. For some, learning could take place in religious communities. For others, it might happen through private teaching. And in towns, some young people could learn skills connected to the trade they were preparing to enter. But for many ordinary young people, their education happened somewhere else. It happened while they were working. They learned by watching their parents, by copying experienced workers, by listening to older people, and by making mistakes until they finally understood how to do something properly. A young person might never sit in a classroom, but they could still spend years learning. They learned how to grow food, how to care for animals, how to make things by hand, how to manage a household, and how to survive in the world they had been born into. Instead of rows of desks and quiet classrooms, learning often happened beside a workbench, in a field, or near the warmth of a household fire. In a strange way, the world itself was their classroom. But there was one thing that made knowledge especially valuable. If you had the chance to learn something that others could not, that knowledge could completely change your future. It could open doors. It could create opportunities. And it could take you somewhere very different from the life your parents had lived. Still, for many medieval young people, the future was not decided by what they wanted to study. It was decided by the family they were born into. And sometimes, the next big decision waiting for them had nothing to do with school or work at all. It had to do with love, marriage, and the person they might spend the rest of their life with. For a medieval teenager, growing up was not only about learning to work. At some point, another question could begin to appear. Who would you spend your life with? Today, most young people are given plenty of time before they have to think seriously about marriage. You might have years to grow up, to meet different people, to discover what you want from life, and to decide what kind of future you hope to build. In medieval society, things could be very different. Marriage was often connected to family, money, land, and social position. For many families, it was not simply a decision between two people who happened to fall in love. It could shape the future of an entire household. This meant that the wishes of young people were not always the only thing that mattered. If you belonged to a wealthy family, marriage could help strengthen relationships between families. It could bring land, money, or important connections. For families with fewer resources, marriage could also be part of creating a more stable future. That this does not mean that medieval teenagers had no feelings of their own. They could still fall in love. They could still have crushes. They could still feel excited when they saw someone they liked. They could still dream about spending their lives with someone special. Human feelings did not disappear just because the world around them was different. That love and marriage were not always the same thing. A young person might care deeply for someone, while their family had completely different plans. and this could make growing up even more complicated. Imagine being young and knowing that one of the biggest decisions of your life could be shaped by people much older than you. Your parents might have opinions. Your relatives might have expectations. And the traditions of your community could influence what was considered acceptable. For some young people, marriage happened relatively early. For others, it came much later. And the experience could vary greatly depending on where they lived, their social class, and their family circumstances. So there was no single age when every medieval teenager suddenly became ready for marriage. But there was often one shared expectation. As you grew older, you were expected to begin thinking about the years ahead. Work, family, marriage, responsibility. The carefree days of childhood were slowly replaced by choices that could shape the rest of your life. And yet, even in a world where family expectations mattered so much, young people still found ways to experience romance. They could meet at festivals, where music filled the air and villagers came alive with conversation. They could meet at markets, during community celebrations, or simply through the everyday life of their village or town. There were smiles, glances, whispered conversations, and perhaps even secret feelings that no parent ever knew about. Because no matter how much society tried to guide the future, the human heart was not always so easy to control. And if medieval teenagers could find love in a world like this, they could also find something else. Fun. Because despite all the work, rules, and responsibilities, young people still needed time to laugh, and they were surprisingly good at finding it. When you imagine a medieval teenager, you might picture someone working all day, and perhaps that was true for many of them. But even in a world filled with hard work and responsibility, young people still needed time to enjoy themselves. They still wanted to laugh, to spend time with friends, and to forget about their responsibilities for a little while. The Middle Ages were not a world without entertainment. It simply looked very different from the entertainment we know today. There were no screens or endless distractions waiting for them whenever they felt bored. Instead, entertainment was often something people created for themselves. And one of the best places to find it was at a festival. On special days, ordinary villages and towns could suddenly feel completely different. People gathered together. There was music, food, dancing, and plenty of conversation. The sound of laughter could fill the streets. The smell of food could drift through the air. And people who were usually busy with work could finally come together. For a teenager, these events could be an exciting break from the ordinary routine of life. You might see friends you had not spoken to in a while. You could meet new people. And perhaps, if you were lucky, you might catch the attention of someone you liked. That festivals were not the only way young people had fun. There were games. Some were played with simple objects that could be found around the home. Others involved physical skill, speed, or strength. Young people could play together, compete against one another, and spend hours enjoying themselves. And then there were stories. Before television and the internet, stories were one of the simplest ways to escape into another world. People gathered around fires or inside warm homes. Someone might tell a tale about a brave hero, a mysterious creature, a great adventure, or something that had supposedly happened long ago. For a teenager listening to these stories, imagination could take them anywhere. And sometimes, fun did not need a special event at all. A group of friends could simply spend time together. They could talk, joke around, tease one another, or find some small way to make an ordinary day more enjoyable. Of course, not every kind of entertainment was approved by parents or authorities. Young people were still young people. They could be curious. They could be mischievous. And sometimes they probably enjoyed doing exactly what they had been told not to do. A quiet evening could turn into laughter. A simple gathering could become an unforgettable memory. And a group of teenagers could find their own ways to have fun. Even when the adults around them were busy with work, In some ways, this part of medieval life may feel surprisingly familiar, because no matter how different the world was, young people still wanted the same simple things: a little freedom, a little laughter, and time with people who made them feel happy. The world around them may have been very different from ours. The teenagers themselves, perhaps they were not so different from us after all. After everything we've seen so far, it might be easy to imagine that medieval teenagers were completely different from young people today. Their clothes were different. Their homes were different. Their daily lives were different. Even the world around them looked completely unfamiliar. And yet, underneath all of that, something remained surprisingly familiar. They were still teenagers. They could be curious. They could be stubborn. They could become excited about small things. And they could sometimes make decisions that left the adults around them wondering what they had been thinking. Just like teenagers today, they were still learning how to understand themselves. They were growing older, searching for their place, and slowly discovering what kind of person they wanted to become. Sometimes that meant disagreeing with their parents. A young person might have their own ideas about how they wanted to live. They might not always agree with what their family expected from them. And even in a world where families had a great deal of influence over young people's lives, teenagers could still find small ways to express themselves. They could choose the friends they spent time with. They could decide who they trusted. They could share jokes and stories that adults were not part of. And they could sometimes get into trouble. Of course, the trouble they got into was not always the same as today. There were no modern distractions constantly following them, but there were still plenty of ways for young people to be curious, rebellious, and mischievous. A teenager could sneak away from their work, stay out longer than they were supposed to, play a prank on a friend, or simply ignore an instruction they had been given. These might seem like small things, but they reveal something important. Teenagers have always wanted a little freedom. They have always wanted to spend time with their friends. And they have always had moments when they thought they knew better than the adults around them. Even the way they experienced emotions may feel familiar. A friendship could mean everything. A small argument could feel like the end of the world. A compliment could stay in your mind all day. And seeing someone you liked could suddenly make an ordinary day feel much more exciting. These feelings did not disappear in the Middle Ages. People may have lived differently, but they still carried the same complicated human emotions. Perhaps this is why learning about medieval teenagers feels so fascinating. At first, their lives seem impossibly distant from ours, but the closer we look, the more familiar they become. They were growing up, searching for their place, learning how to understand the world around them, and sometimes simply trying to get through another day without getting into trouble. Because beneath the walls of old villages, beside busy marketplaces, and around the warmth of shared fires, young people were still experiencing the same hopes, worries, and emotions that young people feel today. But there was one thing that made their teenage years much more dangerous than ours, because the world they were growing up in could be surprisingly unforgiving. And sometimes, even an ordinary day could suddenly become dangerous. For all the things medieval teenagers had in common with young people today, there was one major difference. The world around them was far less forgiving. An ordinary day could include dangers that most teenagers today rarely have to think about. Even simple work could become risky. A teenager working on a farm might handle sharp tools. They could work around large animals. They might climb trees, carry heavy loads, or spend long hours in difficult weather. There were no modern safety rules to protect them, and if something went wrong, there was often very little anyone could do. The same was true for those learning trades in busy workshops. A blacksmith's apprentice might spend the day near hot metal and open flames. Someone learning another craft could work with sharp tools or heavy equipment. These skills had to be learned through practice, but mistakes could sometimes have serious consequences. And then there were dangers that had nothing to do with work. Illness was a constant part of life. A simple infection could become dangerous because treatments were limited, and people did not understand many diseases in the way we do today. Doctors were not available to everyone. And for a young person, getting sick could be frightening. For a family, it could be devastating. Even food could sometimes become uncertain. A poor harvest could mean less food for everyone. Bad weather could damage crops. A cold winter or an empty grain store could affect an entire household. And when there was not enough to eat, those growing up in the family suffered along with everyone else. But perhaps one of the strangest things about these dangers was how normal they could feel. A medieval teenager did not wake up every morning thinking about all the things that could go wrong. Just like us, they were busy thinking about their own lives. They were thinking about work, friends, family, maybe someone they liked. They were making plans for the next day. And yet, the world around them could change very quickly. An accident, an illness, a failed harvest. Something that began as an ordinary moment could suddenly become something much more serious. This was simply part of growing up in a world where life was less predictable. And yet, not every medieval teenager faced the same level of danger, because there was another factor that could completely change your experience of growing up. The family you were born into. A wealthy teenager and a poor teenager could live in the same century, and yet feel as if they belonged to completely different worlds. One might spend their youth learning, traveling, and preparing for a comfortable future. The other might spend every day working simply to help their family survive. And the difference between those two lives could begin from the moment they were born. Imagine two teenagers living in the Middle Ages. They are the same age. They live in the same century. They may even live in the same town. And yet their lives could be completely different. One was born into a wealthy family. The other was born into a poor one. For the wealthy teenager, life could be far more comfortable. They might live in a larger home with warmer rooms, stored food, and more space around them. They could have better clothing, better meals, and people nearby who helped with many everyday tasks. Instead of spending every day doing exhausting physical work, they might have time to learn skills that were considered important for their future. They could receive an education, learn to read and write, study music, learn about religion, or prepare for the responsibilities that came with their family's position. Their future might already be carefully planned. And although that could bring its own pressures, they were likely to have opportunities that many other young people could only imagine. A poor teenager lived a very different life. Their family might depend on their work. Every pair of hands mattered. They could spend their days working in fields, helping at home, caring for animals, or learning a trade. There was often little time to think about the life they hoped to build. Their main concern might simply be helping their family survive another season. Even something as ordinary as food could reveal the difference. A wealthy family might have access to a wider variety of foods. They could afford better ingredients. And during special occasions, they might enjoy meals that would have been completely out of reach for poorer families. For a poor teenager, meals could be much simpler. Bread and grains might make up much of their daily food. Whatever was available had to be used carefully. And when harvests were poor, life could become even harder. Clothing was another clear sign of the difference. A wealthy teenager might have several outfits made from better materials. Their clothing could show their family's position. A poor teenager, on the other hand, might have only a few simple pieces of clothing. They were practical. They were repaired when they became worn, and they were often passed down from one person to another. Even their futures could look completely different. A wealthy teenager might have the chance to travel, to study, to enter a respected profession, or to marry into another powerful family. A poor teenager might have far fewer choices. Their future could depend on finding work, learning a useful skill, or helping their family survive. And yet, there was something both teenagers shared. Neither of them had chosen the family they were born into. They simply opened their eyes one morning and found themselves in a world that had already decided many things for them. The wealthy teenager might have had more comfort, but that did not mean they had complete freedom. Their family could still influence their education, their work, their friendships, and even who they might marry. The poor teenager might have had fewer opportunities, but they could still find happiness in simple things. A meal shared with family, a conversation with a friend, a festival, a quiet evening after a long day. So, while money could completely change the way a medieval teenager lived, it did not change everything. Rich or poor, young people still had hopes. They still had fears. They still wondered what the future would bring. And they still had ordinary days filled with small moments that made life feel worth living. But if we want to understand what a medieval teenager's life really felt like, we need to look even closer at the food they ate, the clothes they wore, the places they slept, and all the small details that made up an ordinary day. Because sometimes the simplest parts of everyday life can tell us the most about the past. So, what did an ordinary day actually look like for a medieval teenager? The answer depended on where you lived, who your family was, and what kind of work you were expected to do. But for most young people, life followed a rhythm that was closely connected to the seasons. Your day began when the world around you began to wake. There were no clocks ringing beside your bed, no bright screen waiting for your attention. The rising sun and the needs of your household often decided when it was time to get up. And once you were awake, there was work to do. Breakfast, if you had it, was usually simple. Bread could be an important part of the daily diet. You might eat it with porridge, cheese, or whatever food was available in your household. For wealthier families, meals could be much more varied. There might be meat, fish, fresh vegetables, fruit, or spices that poorer families could rarely afford. But for many ordinary families, food was less about variety and more about having enough to get through each season. What you ate depended heavily on the time of year. During a good harvest, there could be plenty of food stored away. But during difficult years, families had to be much more careful. Every piece of food mattered. And then there was clothing. A medieval teenager did not have a wardrobe filled with different outfits for every occasion. Most people owned only a small number of clothes. A young person might wear a simple tunic or dress made from wool or linen. Depending on the season and their family's wealth, they might have a cloak or another layer to protect them from the cold. Shoes could be expensive, so they had to be cared for. And when clothing became worn, it was repaired rather than immediately replaced. For a poor family, clothes might be passed from one person to another. So what you wore could tell people a great deal about where you came from. But clothing was only one part of daily life. The rest of the day was usually filled with work. A teenager living on a farm might spend hours in the fields. They could help with planting or harvesting. They might care for animals, carry water, gather firewood, or help prepare food. A teenager living in a town could have a completely different routine. They might spend the day in a workshop, helping a master, preparing materials, learning a craft, or working in a family business. And even after the main work was finished, there were still things to do. The home needed to be cleaned. Food needed to be prepared. Animals needed attention. Tools needed to be stored away. The evening might finally bring a little time to rest. This was when families could gather together. People might talk about the day's events. Someone could tell a story. A young person might spend time with friends. And for a few quiet hours, the day's responsibilities could finally fade into the background. Then came the night. And without electric lights, the world became much darker than anything most of us experience today. A fire might provide warmth and a little light. Candles or lamps could be used by those who could afford them. But for many people, the night simply meant slowing down. The household became quiet. The work was finished, and eventually it was time to sleep. Then, the next morning, the same rhythm began again. Wake, work, eat, rest, and begin again. It may sound repetitive to us, but within that routine were all the small moments that made up a person's life. A good meal, a funny conversation, a beautiful summer evening, a festival, a friend, a first love. These were the moments that made an ordinary medieval life feel like a life. And slowly, almost without noticing, the child they once were became a memory of the past. Year after year, the teenager who had once depended on others became someone with responsibilities, someone with their own place in the community, someone who was no longer simply preparing for adulthood, but already living it. There was no single moment when a medieval teenager suddenly became an adult. No ceremony, no official announcement, no birthday that changed everything overnight. Instead, childhood disappeared slowly, almost so slowly that you might not even notice it happening. One year, you were helping your parents because you were still young. Then little by little, people began depending on you. Your work became more important. Your decisions began to matter, and the responsibilities that once belonged to adults slowly became part of your own life. Perhaps you had started as a child carrying small buckets of water. Now, you could be trusted to manage an entire task on your own. Perhaps you had once followed your parents into the fields. Now, you were expected to know exactly what needed to be done. Perhaps you had once watched an experienced craftsperson working. Now, someone younger might be watching you, and without anyone saying it out loud, something had changed. You were no longer simply learning how the world worked. You were becoming part of it. For some teenagers, this transition happened through work. They became skilled enough to earn money. They took on greater responsibility in the family business, or they began working independently. For others, it happened through marriage. They started their own household. They became responsible for another person, and eventually perhaps for children of their own. For some, the change came when they left their family behind. They moved to another town, joined a workshop, entered a religious community, or simply began building a life that was no longer centered around their childhood home. The path was different for everyone, but the direction was often the same: forward. And perhaps this is one of the most interesting things about medieval teenagers. They did not necessarily wake up one morning and think, "I am an adult now." They simply kept moving through life. One responsibility led to another. One year became the next. And eventually, they realized that the person they had been as a child was far behind them. Of course, becoming an adult did not mean they suddenly stopped enjoying themselves. They could laugh, make friends, fall in love, enjoy festivals and stories, dream about the future. Growing older did not erase the young person they had once been. It simply added more responsibilities to their life. And perhaps that is true for us as well. Even today, growing up is rarely a single moment. It happens quietly. A little more independence here, a little more responsibility there, until one day, you look back and realize that childhood has become something you remember, rather than something you live. For medieval teenagers, that transition could happen much earlier than it does for many people today. That they still carried pieces of childhood with them. The games they played, the friends they made, the stories they heard, the familiar paths through their village, and the small memories that stayed with them long after they had grown older. Because even when childhood disappeared, those memories did not. And perhaps the most surprising thing is that, despite everything that made medieval life so different from ours, some parts of growing up have barely changed at all. The need to belong, the desire to be understood, the excitement of discovering something new, and the quiet hope that, somehow, the road ahead will lead somewhere good. After everything we've discovered, it might seem as though medieval teenagers lived in a completely different universe. They worked differently. They dressed differently. They ate different food. They lived in homes without electricity, modern medicine, or all the technology that surrounds us today. And yet, the closer we look at their lives, the more familiar they begin to feel. Because beneath all those differences, they were still human. And being young has always come with certain feelings that seem to cross every century. A medieval teenager could wonder what other people thought of them. They could worry about fitting in. They could feel embarrassed when they made a mistake in front of their friends. They could become excited about seeing someone they liked. And they could spend far too much time thinking about a single conversation. These feelings might sound familiar, because they are. A teenager living hundreds of years ago could experience the same nervous excitement that a young person feels today when they are waiting to see someone special. They could wonder whether a friend truly liked them. They could feel hurt after an argument. They could laugh until they couldn't stop. And they could have days when everything seemed wonderful, followed by days when nothing seemed to go right. They also had dreams. Of course, their dreams were shaped by the world they lived in. A young farmer might dream of having their own piece of land. An apprentice might dream of becoming skilled enough to open a workshop. Someone from a wealthy family might dream of traveling, learning, or building a respected life. Their dreams may have looked different from ours, but the feeling behind them was not. They wanted a future that felt hopeful. They wanted to be respected. They wanted to belong somewhere. And they wanted to believe that their lives could become something good. Even the small things mattered. A favorite place to sit. A friend who always made you laugh. A meal you looked forward to. A festival that came only once a year. A story you never got tired of hearing. These little things may seem unimportant when we look back hundreds of years later, but for the people living those lives, they were part of what made each day meaningful. And perhaps this is why the history of medieval teenagers feels so surprisingly close to us. We often imagine the past as a world filled with people who are completely unlike us. But history is not only about kings and battles. It is also about ordinary young people waking up in the morning, wondering what the day would bring, trying to finish their work, meeting their friends, falling in love, getting into trouble, and slowly figuring out who they wanted to become. The world around them has disappeared. The houses they lived in may be gone. The roads they walked have changed, and most of their names have been forgotten. That somewhere in those forgotten villages and quiet streets, young people once looked toward tomorrow with the same curiosity and uncertainty we feel today, because the feelings they experienced are still recognizable. The excitement of being young, the uncertainty of growing up, the desire to be free, the hope for a better future, those things have survived. And perhaps, when you think about it that way, a medieval teenager does not seem quite so distant after all. They lived in a world that disappeared long ago. But in some of the most important ways, they were just like us. So, after everything we've seen, what was it really like to grow up in the Middle Ages? The truth is, there was no single answer. Being a teenager in medieval times could mean completely different things depending on who you were, where you lived, how much money your family had, and what kind of future had been prepared for you. For some young people, growing up meant long days of work. It meant waking before sunrise, helping your family, learning a trade, and slowly taking on responsibilities that would shape the rest of your life. For others, it meant leaving home at a young age, learning a craft from a master, or entering a world that was completely unfamiliar. Some had the opportunity to study. Others never had the chance to sit in a classroom. Some grew up surrounded by comfort. Others knew what it meant to worry about food, work, and survival. And yet, all of them were growing up in the same basic way. One day at a time. They were learning, changing, making mistakes, building friendships, finding love, and slowly becoming the people they would eventually be. Perhaps the biggest surprise is that medieval teenagers were not simply miniature adults. They were young people. They laughed. They played games. They enjoyed festivals. They had friends they cared about. They fell in love. They dreamed about the future. The world around them may have been difficult, but they still found moments of happiness within it. And perhaps that's the real lesson hidden inside their stories. Growing up has never been easy. Every generation has its own challenges. Every century brings its own dangers. The things that worried a medieval teenager might be different from the things that worry young people today. At the feeling of standing at the edge of adulthood, wondering what kind of life is waiting ahead, has probably always been the same. So perhaps the next time you hear someone talk about the Middle Ages, you might imagine something different. Not only castles, not only kings and queens, not only battles and old legends, but a young person waking up before sunrise, a teenager walking through a quiet village, someone working beside their family, an apprentice learning a new skill, a young person laughing with friends at a festival, someone quietly wondering if another person feels the same way about them, a teenager lying awake at night thinking about tomorrow. These moments may have happened hundreds of years ago, but they were still moments of ordinary human life. And perhaps that is why the story of medieval teenagers is so fascinating. Because the world they lived in has disappeared. Their homes have faded. Their clothes are long gone. Their voices have fallen silent. But their hopes, their fears, their friendships, and their dreams still feel strangely familiar. They were born into a world very different from ours, yet they still had to grow up, just like we do. And maybe that is the most surprising truth of all. No matter how much the world changes, being young has never been as simple as it looks. And somewhere, hundreds of years ago, another teenager was waking beneath the first light of morning, wondering what the day ahead might bring.